Hi, so it's almost the end of the year and I had the very original idea of making a video about the top 10 books I read this year. I know, very original, no one's done this before. So here's how this is going to work. We'll go through my top 10 books and I'll talk about 1 to 2 surprising informations that I've read for each book. The top 10 books will not be in any specific order. The first one I start with is not my top 10 and this last one I end with is not my top 1. It's all in random order. And also, if you want to buy any of these books, the links to buy them will be in the description down below. And if you use the link in my description to buy the books, it will give me a commission of about like 4%. So if you want to support me, you know what to click on. So now let's start. Number 1, The Geography of Thought by Richard E. Nisbett. This book is a book about how Asians and Westerners think differently and perceive the world differently. I found this book by reading one of Richard Nisbett's other book that is number 8 on this list. The most interesting part about the book for me was when he talked about how the ecology, the physical environment, and how like its shape has shaped the way Westerners and Asians view the world. That ecology and the humans living within it shaped the economy of the land, and the economy shaped the social structures, and after that those social structures shape what people paid attention to. So for example, if your social structure is more collectivist, then people will pay more attention about their role within their family and the society. But if the social structure is more individualist, then people will pay more attention about themselves and individual things. And then after that, what people pay attention to shape their metaphysics. Metaphysics, basically what it means is things that are abstract, like time, like your identity, like space itself, the abstract space, not literal space. Metaphysics influence their epistemology, meaning the study of knowledge, study of what's true and how do you achieve truth, or how do you know that something is true or not. And finally, the epistemology will influence the cognitive processes that you have. But this chain of influences doesn't just go one way. It goes the other way too. So your ecology shape your cognitive processes by a long chain of influences, and then your cognitive processes will reinforce this ecology by shaping it with your hands. For example, like the institution that you'll put in place will reinforce everything else in the chain. For example, in China, the ecology, the fertile plains, low mountains, and navigable rivers made it a perfect land to do agriculture, especially rice farming. And rice farming in general required a lot of cooperation. And this ecology made it easy for centralized control to take place because irrigation systems were needed to farm the rice. So for example, if you have an irrigation system like the Yellow River that you see here, if you're a king or if you're an emperor or anything, then you can just sit there or sit anywhere and control the irrigation system. And the person who controls the irrigation system pretty much controls the land because he controls the food supply. And that's why it was really easy for people like emperors to centralize their power. So from the very beginning, the average Chinese peasant had to understand all the social structures around him, from the one he had with his neighbor to the one he had with his ruler. This led to their cognitive processes to become more collectivist. Greece, on the other hand, Greece is completely different. It has a completely different ecology because there's lots of mountains in Greece. That made fishing, hunting, herding, and trading to be the most common types of occupations 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. These occupations didn't require that much cooperation, so this created a different type of economy and social structure, which led to the development of different cognitive processes that were a bit more individualist. Now, these are all averages. Asians within Asia think differently because there's different country, there's different ecology, but on average, Asians think more alike than Westerners, and Westerners, on average, even if it's a bunch of different countries, think more in a individualistic way. And also, like, the book doesn't try to say that individualism is better than collectivism or vice versa. It doesn't say that, just because Westerners think in a more logical structure, therefore it's better. In the book, he talks about the advantages of both ways of viewing the world and their advantages based on the situation and the context they found themselves in. So if you're interested about how your way of viewing the world differs from other people, I would recommend reading this book because we unfortunately cannot experience someone else's subjective experience. It's sometimes hard to understand why somebody would act or think in a different way. Number 2 is The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons by Sam Keen. The goal of the book is to teach about the brain and how it works, but not in a boring way. The author tries to do it by telling a real event that happened in history, where he can then take a moment and explain, for example, the context in the neuroscience community around like what debates were they having at the time, what discovery did they make. So for example, in the book, he talks about Charles Guiteau and his assassination of the US President James A. Garfield, and he talks about like the context within it and what was happening with this guy. But funnily enough, the information that really surprised me in the book was not about the brain, it was about the US Civil War. What I found interesting is that the Civil War happened between 1861 and 1865, and before around 1847 you had 2 types of firearms that you could choose. Either you could choose a musket that could be reloaded fairly quickly, nothing like today obviously, but you could probably shoot every 20 to 30 seconds if you were good at reloading quickly, but the gun was really inaccurate. because the musket ball bounced inside the barrel. Because what they were doing is basically they had these paper cartridges and they would bit off the top, put the gunpowder in, and then just put the whole paper with a musket ball into it. So that the diameter of the musket barrel had to be quite large to fit everything in. But it was very convenient. But around the beginning of the 1800s, I think, they started using rifles that could shoot much more accurately. The barrels had spiraling grooves, as you can see here, and that allowed the bullet to spin inside the barrel and spin like a football and then shoot out straight out the gun. So you would put your gunpowder into the barrel, then you would put the bullet in, ram it down, and finally shoot. The thing is, for the bullet to follow the grooves, for the bullet to spin on the grooves, the bullet's diameter had to be about the same as the barrel's diameter. That made those bullets extremely hard to load, and they would often jam in the barrel because you needed to push them down. And so the musket, really easy to load, but really inaccurate, and the rifle, really hard to load, but really accurate. That was the situation before 1847. But after 1847, a Frenchman called Claude-Étienne Minier created the Minier balls. So this is Minier, and this is his bullets. And the advantage with those bullets is that they were made out of lead. Lead is a pliable metal and expands rapidly when heated. That meant that the bullet didn't have to fit that snugly in the barrel because it would expand when fired. When you ignited the gunpowder and it exploded, that would create enough heat to make the bullet expand and hug the wall of the barrel. This made the rifle 3 times deadlier than any other weapons before that because it was accurate and easy to load. So you had the best of both worlds, the best of the musket and the rifle. And not only that, but since it was made of lead, the bullet would shatter or just flatten inside the body, causing even more damage than even today's bullets. Because today's bullet, they can just pierce through and go out from the other side because it's made of another metal. But lead, on the other hand, this is what happened. This is a video of what happens when you get shot by a lead bullet. It goes inside the skin and flattens out. And then since it flattens, it loses its speed and gets stuck inside the body, causing even more damage, shattering the bones and causing all sorts of damages to the muscle. So yeah, not a pretty sight to see. Thing is, since it was the first time that these types of bullets were used in actual combat, military generals didn't adapt their strategies for weapons that were accurate and easy to load. So the generals still used Napoleonic charges where, all the soldiers would be arranged in lines and would charge line by line. That used to work before because with the reload time and the inaccuracy of the musket, if you charge with enough soldiers, most of them will survive, or at least enough of them will survive so that you can, after that, kill your enemy. But with the Minier bullets, however, soldiers would just get shot down one by one. And that's why the Minier bullets were responsible for 90% of the death during the Civil War. So yeah, this book's pretty interesting if you want to learn not only about the history of neuroscience, but also about all sorts of other things. This is an introductory book, so if you don't know anything about neuroscience, you can pick this book right up and feel right at home. Number 3 is Unreasonable Faith by James Fodor. I decided to read this book because I had a discussion with this one guy where he was trying to give evidence for the existence of God by saying that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist and therefore the universe has a cause. And the cause must be timeless, beginningless, and immaterial. Therefore, the cause is a being that is timeless, beginningless, and immaterial. Therefore, that's God, basically. So I tried to read the original argument and find more information on it. And eventually, I landed on this book. In the book, he goes over all of the arguments that William Lane Craig famously uses. This is William Lane Craig, if you don't know. He famously uses those arguments to prove the existence of God. The book is called Unreasonable Faith in response to Craig's book, Reasonable Faith. The most interesting information in this book was the explanation that he gave for the resurrection of Jesus. For the resurrection of Jesus, usually there are 4 main historical facts surrounding it that are generally accepted. The first one is that after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph in the tomb. Second fact is that on the Sunday following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. The third fact is that on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people saw Jesus alive from the dead. And last fact is that the original disciples came to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead despite predispositions to the contrary. To those facts, the author responds with the RHBS model to explain them. Basically, the model explains the fact by saying that there was a rebirth here. Then people started experiencing hallucinations of Jesus because of their grief and emotional excitement. Right here, after these individual hallucinations happened, it created an expectation that it might happen to other people because, you have an experience of Jesus appearing in front of you, then you tell other people, and then other people are like, okay, well, that must mean something, so like he's coming back or something. And so it created the perfect conditions for group religious experiences are right here. And then finally, there was cognitive memory and social biases that marginalized the doubt here. And you can see, as opposed to the resurrection hypothesis, which claims that God exists, therefore he desired to raise Jesus from the dead. That's why Jesus' tomb was found empty. And then that's why the appearances happen. Now, I won't go into too much detail because there's a lot of details to go over, but he goes on and explains how in history there were other examples of individuals and collective hallucinations. And this is not as rare as people might assume. It happened in other religions and it happened with other characters in history. So if you want to read about the rebuttals for the Kalam cosmological argument and the resurrection of Jesus, I would recommend you read this book. But I warn you, it's not like a wow, it's an interesting book for me, but it's not like the most interesting book you'll pick up. The book is structured basically, it's argument 1, counter argument 1, argument 2, counter argument 2, argument 3, counter. So if you're not into that type of books, don't read it. Now, before we move on to number 4, don't forget to like and subscribe and let me know in the comments down below, what is your favorite book of 2024? I'll take a look at them and I might read them in the future. Now, number 4 is called Understanding Philosophy of Science by James Ladyman. I decided to read this one because I was having a hard time explaining what was the difference between science and religion and why we should believe the scientific process more than our individual experiences. So I decided to research about philosophy of science and I came upon this book. And to be honest, I thought I would finish this book with a straightforward answer about what makes science true. But that wasn't the case. I ended up being more confused than when I started. But one argument I found very interesting is the no miracle argument. So here's a little context. There are people that call themselves instrumentalists. The instrumentalists are part of the anti-realism camp for science. People who are anti-realists, basically what they believe is that what science tells us is not true. There's no reason to believe that what science, like electrons or like the theory of relativity, anything that they tell us, any concept is true. And instrumentalists believe that, okay, most likely not true what science tells us, but if it can used to predict stuff, then we should use it as a tool, so as an instrument. And then there are people that are called scientific realists, and they believe that the scientific theories we have refer to true things or are approximately true. And one argument to prove that they are approximately true is the no miracle argument, and it goes like this. If our theories are not approximately true, or unobservable entities that are described in those theories don't really exist, then it would be a miracle that things like microwave or an electron microscope behave exactly like they would if electromagnetic waves and atoms existed. It would be a miracle that we have made so much advancements in our technologies, but none of the underlying stuff that our theories tells us that exist. So isn't it more plausible that those unobservable entities really exist? To me, this is a compelling argument, but it reminds me a lot of the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. The fine-tuning argument basically goes, look at the universe, look at how fine-tuned it is. Isn't it more easier to believe that it's not chance that brought this universe to be, but it's actually a God? The reason why I find the fine-tuning argument not really compelling is because I've read more about this argument. So perhaps if I read more about the no miracle argument, it'll become less compelling. I don't know. So yeah, I'll need to read a lot more about the philosophy of science for it to make sense to me. And I might make a video about it in the future. Now, number 5 is The Atheist Guide to Reality by Alexander Rosenberg. The book title says it all. It's a book about how to explain reality from an atheist point of view. I don't remember how I came upon this book, but I'm glad I did because he explains everything really clearly and there's a lot of valuable information in this book. I personally think he goes a bit too far when it comes to depression. He wrote, basically I'm paraphrasing here, that if you feel depressed or overcome by world weariness, just take Prozac or any other antidepressant of your choice, and if it doesn't work, just switch to another one until it does. His opinion is a bit more nuanced than that, but that's the gist of it. One of the most interesting information in this book was about morality. He basically says that morality isn't objective, but most humans have the same core moral principles, and that is why we can cooperate as much as we do. He then lists all of the moral principles. So, for example, don't cause gratuitous pain to a newborn baby, especially your own. That seems like a pretty straightforward core moral principles that everyone believes in. Protect your children. If you earn something, you have a right to it. It's permissible to restrict complete strangers' access to your personal possessions. It's okay to punish people who intentionally do wrong. So the vast majority of people have these core moral principles, but the reason moral disagreements happen, he says, is because we don't live in the same factual world. The way he explains it basically is that we have our core moral principles, and then you add the factual understanding of the world, and that equals how you apply your morality in practice. So for example, a devout Christian and an atheist might both believe that you should protect your children, but if their son comes to them and say, Dad, I'm gay, then they will react both differently, even though they had the same core moral principle. The devout Christian might say to his son, listen, there's people that gamble, there's people that drink alcohol. We all feel those urges. Some people have it, some people don't. And it's the same thing for homosexuality. It's an urge, but it's also a sin, so you should not engage in it. But the atheist might say, all right, son, I accept you as you are, and I love you as you are, and bring your boyfriend home if you want. Both actually have the same core moral principle. They're both expressing their love for their children, but they're doing it in a different way because they have a different factual understanding of the world. This is something I'll have to think more about. I'm not exactly sure where I stand on it, and that is why I recently got the book The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod. Number 6, Democracy for Realists by Christopher H. Aiken and Larry N. Bartels. The book is about how to view democracy in a more realist way. There's this idea that is called the folk theory of democracy that basically states that the reason that democracy works is because citizens are informed and engaged, and therefore make rational decisions about whom to vote for. But as we've noticed with social media for the past 15 years, the average voter is not really informed. So the book talks about how do citizens actually make their decisions on who to vote for, and how sometimes more democracy is not the answer and can actually hurt the populace. The most surprising information found in the book, I think, was when he was talking about 2 towns in New Jersey. So the first town is Spring Lake, and then there's Beach Haven. These towns in 1916 had multiple shark attacks. These shark attacks led to multiple people canceling their stay at the resorts present in those towns and caused those resorts to lose a lot of money. Now, even if the president wasn't responsible for the shark attacks, he didn't release sharks into the wild, and that didn't happen, the 2 towns made Woodrow Wilson pay at the poll. As you can see, there's minus 8.25% for Spring Lake and minus 10.5% for Beach Haven, compared to the other one who are not close to the beach, who didn't really change compared to the last election. Now, the reason the author suggests for this behavior is because whenever voters face hardship, either economic hardship or shark attacks, or for example, if your crops don't grow as high as you like them to be, as long as they can tie an indirect link to the president, they will make the incumbent pay, even if according to the folk theory of democracy, it would be irrational for a voter to do such a thing. It reminds me of how economists in the past thought that people were really rational when it came to making economic decisions. But now, as we've researched a bit more, now we understand that we're Homo sapiens, not Homo economicus. I think that's how they're called. For example, there's these 2 books that talks about how people are not really rational. There's Misbehaving by I don't know who, and there's Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. So these books will be in the description down below if you want to buy them. Moving on. Number 7 is called King, A Life by Jonathan Agg. It's a book about basically Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and everything around it. It's a very long and detailed book, but it's worth reading every pages. For this book, there was 2 surprising informations that struck me. The first one is obviously the amount of affairs that MLK had while he was alive. I think FBI released he had 45 lovers, total lovers. And the second is a story about a man who was listening to one of King's convention when suddenly he stood up, ran up towards King and punched him twice in the face. King didn't fight back and said to the others, "Don't touch him, don't touch him." And finally, King went to talk to him and said that he wasn't going to bring charges against him, and if he wanted, he could return to his seat and listen to the rest of the program. This is a picture that they took. This is, I think he's called Roy James, and this is King talking to him, even though a few minutes earlier, he literally punched him in the face twice. The amount of self-restraint King had for stuff like this was exceptional, really. But I guess, just like a video game, he had put all his points into self-restraint towards people who attacked him, that he had none left when it comes to self-restraint towards affairs. You can't have it all. Now, number 8 is called Intelligence and How to Get It by the same author of the first book that I talked about at the beginning of the video, called Richard E. Nesbitt. Now, this one I made 2 videos about because I thought that the information in the book was so good, so interesting, so I made 2 videos about it. Link in the description down below if you want to see them. The information that I found really interesting is about the twin studies and how it is really difficult to make good and ethical studies when it comes to twins. For those who don't know, the twin studies are multiple studies that try to study twins separated at birth to calculate how much does the environment affect the behavior and phenotype of twins. Since the twins share 50 to 100% of their genes, most of the differences should come from the environment. Now, the reason why the twin studies are not that reliable is because most of the lives of the twins are very similar. They both develop in the same womb. Second, they both went through the same very stressful adoption process. Third, the twins probably got treated the same way because they look exactly the same from the outside. So their phenotype were the same. So for example, if they're both tall, they will be treated both as tall people. If they're both attractive, they will both benefit from the pretty privilege. Also, they're from the same country, so that makes it even similar. And finally, they're both in a decent adoptive family, because adoptive families, they need to pass tests to make sure that they're not abusive, to make sure that they're high quality homes. And so you cannot say that those studies represent the population, since adoptive families have familial environment that is higher than average. If you really wanted to make a good study, it wouldn't be ethical, but a good study would be one that represents the entire spectrum of familial environments, from very abusive to extremely good, extremely prosperous. Let's just say. So I highly recommend reading this book. Now, number 9 is Redirect by Timothy D. Wilson. It's a book about what causes people to act in the way they do. The premise of the book is that how people act often emanates from their interpretation of the world and how they see themselves within that world. It emanates from the story they tell themselves inside their head. So if you can change the story that people tell themselves, you can probably change their behavior too. That's the premise of the book. Now, one interesting information that I learned in this book is that scared straight programs don't work. It actually makes things worse for the problematic children and teenagers. If you don't know what scared straight programs are, it's basically represented perfectly in this picture. So they take problematic children and teenagers and make them visit a prison. In the prison, there's usually 1 or 2 or 3 prisoners that are tasked to scare the children so that they lose the interest in committing crimes. The thought process behind this program is if you can make a child really, really scared of prison, he will not commit crimes in the future. But in actuality, this program doesn't really work because it first brings problematic children together, allowing them to create social bonds with other problematic kids. And the second reason is because you are teaching the kids that the reason they shouldn't do crimes is because if they do it, they will end up in prison. Not because they're good people, just because they shouldn't go to prison. So in their heads, they're not telling themselves, okay, I'm going to not commit crimes because good people don't commit crimes. They tell themselves a story like, I'm a bad kid and that is why they're bringing me to the prisons to scare me. Prisons are scary, so I won't commit crimes yet. The problem with that is as soon as like that fear of prison goes away because of some environment, then you have nothing preventing them from committing crimes. But if they believe that they're good people and good people don't commit crimes, then you have like a stronger barrier that will prevent them from acting in bad ways. Now, finally, number 10 is Creative Inc. by Ed Catmull. This one I only listened to the audiobook, but I count it here anyway because it was such a good book. The author is Ed Catmull. He's the ex-president and one of the founder of Pixar. And he talks about how to manage a company in a way that keeps the creativity alive and that pumps out good products consistently. In the case of Pixar, as a president, his goal was to make sure that everyone's idea was heard and that he was constantly fixing managerial problems so that the creativity was not, stifled by a complacent board of directors. Now, the most interesting information in the book was about aphantasia. If you don't know, aphantasia is a characteristic that some people have where they cannot imagine images in their head. So as you can see, number 5, that's aphantasia. So there's nothing in their head. It's a spectrum from 1 to 5. 1 is hyperphantasia, where you can picture very vividly images. 2 is less vivid. 3 is no colors. 4 is just the outline. So you might think if you cannot imagine images in your head, you'll probably be less creative than other people and less good at drawing, because if you cannot imagine your drawing in the head, it won't work, right? But in the book, he talks about how having aphantasia doesn't make you less creative than someone who has, for example, hyperphantasia. You just need to use different methods to express your creativity. People who have aphantasia will often imagine emotions instead of images and won't be able to see the drawing in their head and will have to sketch a bit more to see their ideas to life. But that doesn't mean that they're less good than other people. A proof of this is that one legendary animator, Glenn Keane, who was one of the animators working on Little Mermaid, that's Glenn Keane, has aphantasia. That means that even for you, if you're someone who has aphantasia, it is possible to do creative work and be good at it. And on that note, this concludes my top 10 books of 2024. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and share in the comments what is your favorite book of 2024. What did you think about the books that I talked about here? And will you read any of those books in the future? And thank you for watching this video in its entirety, and I'll talk to you next week.